I'm very pleased to be able to confirm for you today that Australia's most wanted man is behind bars. Malcolm John Naden was arrested last night in the Gloucester area of New South Wales.
On the night of March 22, 2012, a large-scale police operation unfolded in the rugged hills near Gloucester, New South Wales. After 7 years of searching, officers finally had a lead on the man who had become Australia's most wanted fugitive, Malcolm Naden. For law enforcement, this was the end of a chase that had stretched across years, hundreds of kilometers, and millions of dollars in resources. For the public, it was the conclusion of one of the most baffling disappearances and manhunts the country had ever seen. Before we move forward, let us know where in the world you're watching from and what is the time there. And make sure to subscribe for more real Australian true crime stories. When police closed in, Naden was found alone at a secluded campsite hidden deep in the bush. He was barefoot, malnourished, and living off stolen food and rainwater. Officers described him as calm, detached, and emotionless during the arrest. He didn't resist. He barely spoke, a quiet surrender after years of silence. The man they had captured wasn't a random wanderer. By then, Malcolm Naden was suspected in 2 murders, several assaults, and the shooting of a police officer. He had lived for years without electricity, without contact, and without being seen. A fugitive who turned the Australian wilderness into his hiding place. His capture ended one of the longest and most expensive manhunts in New South Wales history, but it also raised deeper questions. How did a man from an ordinary family in Tamworth manage to disappear completely? How did he survive in some of the harshest terrain in the country? And what exactly happened in the months before he vanished in 2005, the moment everything began? This is the story of Malcolm Naden, a quiet man who withdrew from the world, the crimes that forced him into hiding, and the relentless search that followed. It's a case that tested police endurance, gripped a nation, and left many wondering. How does someone live undetected for nearly a decade? Malcolm John Naden was born in 1973 and grew up in New South Wales, spending most of his early life around Tamworth and Dubbo. He came from an ordinary working-class family, known locally and not associated with any serious trouble. Yet even in those early years, he was markedly different from those around him. Quiet, withdrawn, and often detached, Naden kept to himself. The kind of person who could go unnoticed in a crowd. He left school early and worked in a local abattoir, a job that required long hours of isolation and little conversation. Former co-workers described him as polite but distant, someone who did his work and left without much interaction. Family members later told reporters that Naden had always been introverted, sometimes disappearing for hours into the bush near town and returning calm, as if solitude steadied him. By his early 30s, Naden had become increasingly private. He avoided social gatherings and rarely spoke to extended relatives. Those who did see him noted a growing interest in Aboriginal spirituality and survivalist practices, topics that seemed harmless at first, but soon began to dominate his thinking. He was fascinated by self-sufficiency and the idea of living outside society, often reading about bush survival and spending nights alone in the open country. At the time, no one saw this as dangerous. In small communities like Dubbo, being quiet wasn't unusual. But in hindsight, that distance was more than shyness. It was withdrawal. As one relative later said, he wasn't violent, he just preferred to be alone. But looking back, maybe he was preparing for something. In early 2005, Naden was living intermittently with extended family in Dubbo, including his cousin Letitia Nolan and her partner. He remained largely on the edges of family life, quiet, helpful when asked, but emotionally absent. No one imagined that within months, 2 members of that same family would vanish or lose their lives, and that Naden himself would become the focus of one of the longest manhunts in New South Wales history. For most of his life, Naden's silence was merely unsettling. But in 2005, that silence would become the dividing line between an ordinary man and one of the most elusive fugitives Australia had ever seen. In early January 2005, the city of Dubbo was shaken by the sudden disappearance of 24-year-old mother of four, Letitia Nolan. She was last seen on the evening of January 4th, leaving a friend's house and driving off in her blue Ford Falcon. When her car was found abandoned the next day near the Macquarie River, doors locked and no sign of her nearby, concern spread quickly. At first, police classified the case as a standard missing person inquiry. But for Letitia's family, the idea that she'd simply walked away never made sense. She was deeply involved in her children's lives, had steady routines, and was close to her relatives. Friends described her as reliable, someone who always called home. Searches began along the riverbanks and surrounding bushland. Officers, volunteers, and local residents scoured the area on foot and by boat. Police divers searched the water. Day after day, there was nothing. No clothing, no phone, not even a footprint to explain what happened that night. As investigators retraced her final movements, one name appeared repeatedly in interviews: Malcolm Naden, her cousin. He had been living with family members in Dubbo around the same time and was believed to have seen Letitia shortly before she vanished. Detectives publicly stated they needed to speak with him to help clarify her last known contacts. He wasn't a suspect, just someone who might hold answers. When officers tried to reach him, Naden had already disappeared. He hadn't collected his wages, hadn't told anyone where he was going, and left behind personal belongings. At first, police considered he might have panicked or gone camping, but as days turned into weeks, it became clear his disappearance was deliberate. By February, two names dominated the local news: Letitia Nolan, missing mother of four, and Malcolm Naden, the relative police urgently wanted to find. Detectives appeared, led through television and newspapers, asking Naden to come forward. He didn't respond. No confirmed sightings, no calls, not a single trace. The Nolan family organized community searches, handing out flyers and walking the river trails every weekend. They spoke to the media regularly, hoping public attention might bring a breakthrough. In one interview, Letitia's father said quietly, "We just want her home. We just want to know she's safe." But the weeks turned into months, and every lead led nowhere. By mid-2005, frustration had turned to fear. Police still had no evidence of what happened to Letitia, and the only person who might explain it was missing too. The case that began as a single disappearance had become two: a young mother who vanished without reason, and a cousin who'd slipped into silence at the same time. That was the moment the story changed direction. What began as a family's desperate search for answers was about to evolve into one of the most extensive manhunts New South Wales had ever seen. And by winter that same year, another tragedy within the same family would push detectives from confusion to certainty, and mark the point where Malcolm Naden officially became Australia's most wanted fugitive. On the evening of June 21st, officers were called to a home in Dubbo belonging to Naden's cousin. Inside, they found the body of 24-year-old Christy Scholes, his cousin's partner. The discovery shocked both the family and investigators. Naden, who had been staying in the same house in the days leading up to the incident, was missing once again. Detectives at the scene quickly realized they were facing something far more serious than a disappearance. The house showed signs of a violent altercation, and witnesses reported that Naden had left suddenly, barefoot and carrying only a small backpack. A man already sought for questioning in one missing person case was now wanted over another, one that had turned deadly. Police launched an immediate manhunt across the Dubbo region. Roadblocks were set up, helicopters searched overhead, and officers combed the surrounding farmland and scrub. Locals were warned not to approach Naden if they saw him, and to report any unusual activity, particularly thefts of food or camping gear. For many in the community, the shock was twofold. A family still reeling from Letitia's disappearance was now faced with another death in the same circle, and the same man at the center of both investigations had vanished once more. Over the following weeks, sightings trickled in from rural areas outside Dubbo, reports of break-ins at farms, missing livestock, stolen canned food. Each clue suggested Naden was alive and surviving in the bush, evading detection while moving deeper into remote country. Police believed he was too, traveling by foot, using his knowledge of the terrain to stay hidden. By July, the search had expanded across western New South Wales. What had begun as a single inquiry into a missing mother had escalated into one of the largest manhunts in state history. Malcolm Naden was now officially classified as a fugitive, wanted for questioning over 2 serious crimes and considered dangerous. His ability to disappear so completely bewildered investigators. No phone records, no electronic traces, no help from friends or relatives. It was as if he'd erased himself. And in the months that followed, as search teams widened their grid, one question began to dominate every briefing. How does a man vanish twice, in plain sight, and leave no trail behind? By late 2005, the search for Malcolm Naden had shifted from a regional police operation to one of the largest coordinated manhunts in New South Wales history. Detectives from across the state were brought in. A dedicated task force was established in Dubbo, and for the first time, police began to accept that Naden wasn't simply hiding, he was surviving. Investigators believed he had moved deep into the bushlands surrounding Dubbo, then further north through the Great Dividing Range. Reports began filtering in from farmers and residents in small rural towns, food missing from pantries, window screens cut, footprints near sheds. Locals would wake to find their dogs restless and doors unlocked. Police started connecting these incidents. Each was close to an area where Naden had once been sighted. In one case, a property owner near Ballamore reported returning home to find his rifle missing. In another, a camping family outside Menduran discovered their supplies gone, replaced by a neat pile of empty tins, a strange detail that became a pattern. Naden was methodical. He took what he needed, nothing more, and left just enough signs to suggest he'd been there, but never enough to track. Throughout 2006, Task Force Naden expanded the search grid. Teams scoured old shearers' huts, caves, and dense scrub. Thermal imaging flights were conducted at night, and bushwalkers were warned to avoid remote areas. Still, he slipped away. Officers described narrow misses, moments where they'd find a still-warm campsite or fresh tracks in the mud. He knew the land better than any of us, one senior officer later recalled. By the time we arrived, he was already gone. Police began to realize that Naden was using his bushcraft deliberately to stay undetected. He had an intimate understanding of the terrain, likely learned from years of solitude around Tamworth and Dubbo. He stole close, thinned from washing lines, collected rainwater, and moved under cover of night. Even as media attention intensified, sightings remained uncertain. Locals would occasionally report a thin, bearded man moving through fields or crossing back roads at dawn, but by the time patrols arrived, the trail was cold. Detectives also began tracking a pattern of small-scale burglaries: food, blankets, ammunition, items that suggested he was surviving without assistance. It became clear that Naden wasn't relying on anyone. He wasn't being hidden or supplied. He was doing it alone. As months turned into years, the hunt took its toll on the officers involved. The search was physically punishing, long stretches in heat, rain, and dense bushland. Many spoke later about the psychological strain of chasing someone who seemed to vanish into thin air. It was like hunting a ghost, one investigator told ABC News years later. Every time we got close, it felt like he could sense it. By 2007, Malcolm Naden had become a name known across Australia. His image was printed on wanted posters in every police station and roadhouse from Dubbo to Queensland. The public was urged to report any sighting immediately, and a reward was offered for information leading to his capture. But the man at the center of it all remained silent, unseen, unheard, and always just out of reach. The bush had swallowed him completely, and the longer he stayed hidden, the more impossible it seemed that anyone would ever catch him. Yet police refused to stop. Each new clue, a broken fence, a stolen rifle, a faint trail of prints through damp soil, reignited the chase. And in the years to come, the manhunt for Malcolm Naden would stretch far beyond Dubbo, across state lines, over mountains, and through the deepest parts of the New South Wales wilderness. As authorities closed in on the man they now called the Ghost of the Bush. By 2011, Malcolm Naden had been on the run for more than 6 years. What began as a regional search had grown into a full-scale national operation. Hundreds of officers, helicopters, and specialized trackers deployed across northern New South Wales. The cost of the manhunt had already reached into the millions, but every time police thought they were close, Naden slipped away. Investigators believed he was moving through the dense mountain ranges near Nowendock, thick bushland that stretched between Tamworth and the coast. Locals had grown used to strange stories: food vanishing from pantries, tool sheds left open, tents unzipped during the night. Farmers reported stolen rifles and half-eaten livestock. At first, many brushed it off as coincidence, until the sightings began again. Residents described a tall, thin man with a long beard, often barefoot, moving through properties late at night. He never spoke, never threatened anyone, but his presence unsettled entire towns. Parents kept children inside after dark. Rural communities began locking doors that had never been locked before. The myth of the ghost of the bush had become something real, a man who could appear and disappear without trace. Then, in December 2011, the silence broke. Acting on fresh intelligence, heavily armed officers from the State Protection Support Unit surrounded a remote property near Nowendock. It was one of several raids conducted in the area, based on reports that Naden had been stealing food nearby. As the team moved in before dawn, a single shot cracked through the darkness. One officer, Detective Senior Constable Robert Bob Fenton, was struck and seriously injured. The shooter, later confirmed as Naden, fled once again into the bush before backup could arrive. The incident marked a turning point. The manhunt was no longer a search for a fugitive. It was now a live threat. He publicly declared Naden armed and dangerous, and the reward for his capture was increased to $250,000. The operation became a statewide priority, with new tactical resources and intelligence analysts joining the effort. For small rural towns in the region, fear turned to paranoia. Every rustle in the bush, every missing chicken, every unlocked door sparked new rumors. Some claimed to have seen his campfires glowing in the hills. Others swore they'd found makeshift shelters or half-eaten food in their sheds. The isolation that once protected him now fed into a kind of quiet dread that spread across the countryside. Police continued to close in, narrowing their search zones through surveillance, heat mapping, and forensic tracking. They began to notice patterns: stolen supplies along a consistent route, evidence of movement between caves and abandoned huts. Despite the years, Naden was showing no signs of fatigue. He was still resourceful, still moving, still surviving. As one officer told reporters later, he wasn't running anymore. He was living out there, waiting, watching. By the end of 2011, the message from police was clear. Malcolm Naden was no longer just hiding. He was surviving, hunting, and fighting back. And now, after years of quiet evasion, the hunt for Australia's most wanted man had entered its most dangerous phase yet. In the early hours of March 22, 2012, tactical police units moved quietly through dense bushland near Gloucester in northern New South Wales. The operation had been planned for days. Intelligence analysts had traced a trail of small thefts in the Barrington Tops area: bread, tinned food, and clothing taken from remote farm sheds. Every sign pointed to one man. Around midnight, officers from the State Protection Support Unit surrounded a weathered cabin hidden among thick forest. There were no lights inside, no movement, just the sound of rain on metal roofing and the steady hum of radios. The team waited, listening. After 7 years of searching, they believed they had finally found him. Command quietly gave the order to move. Police advanced through the darkness, cutting across uneven ground until they reached the cabin's perimeter. One officer peered through a window with night vision equipment. Inside, a figure was lying under a blanket, motionless. Moments later, the breach team moved in. The door opened without resistance. Inside, the man who had eluded police for nearly a decade was asleep, barefoot and unarmed. When the torchlight hit his face, he stirred but didn't reach for anything. Officers called his name. There was no struggle, just a slow glance upward, the look of someone who already knew it was over. At 1:03 a.m., the radio crackled through the static. "We've got him." The man was confirmed to be Malcolm John Naden, wanted in connection with 2 murders, multiple assaults, and the shooting of a police officer. He was thin, pale, and visibly exhausted, the physical cost of years spent hiding in the wild. Those who took part in the arrest later described his demeanor as eerily calm. "He didn't fight, didn't yell, didn't even ask why we were there," one officer recalled. "He just stared, like he'd been waiting for this." When he was led out in cuffs, Naden said almost nothing. He appeared detached, as though the weight of the search, the helicopters, the dogs, the posters, had already passed him by. After 7 years of pursuit, Australia's most wanted man stood in silence as dawn broke over the hills of Gloucester. News of the capture reached Sydney by morning. Police Commissioner Andrew Scipione confirmed that Malcolm Naden was in custody and praised the persistence of the officers involved, calling it an operation built on endurance and patience. For the task force that had hunted him for years, the radio call, "We've got him," ended an era of frustration and near misses. For the families of Letitia Nolan and Christy Scholes, it marked the moment hope and fear converged, when the ghost that had haunted New South Wales finally stepped into the light. After his arrest, Malcolm Naden was transferred under heavy security to Sydney's Silverwater Correctional Centre to await trial. For months, his case dominated national headlines. The man, once known only through police composites and grainy surveillance photos, now stood before the Supreme Court, clean-shaven, subdued, and almost unrecognizable from the fugitive who had lived for years in the bush. In June 2013, Naden pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder, those of his cousin Letitia Nolan and Christy Scholes, along with several additional charges, including indecent assault, aggravated break and enter, and the attempted shooting of a police officer during the No-Wendock raid. His guilty plea meant there would be no lengthy trial, but for the families who had waited years for justice, it brought little comfort. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense and quiet. Prosecutors outlined how Naden had spent 7 years evading capture, surviving entirely off stolen supplies and makeshift shelters. The story, already familiar to the public, felt heavier when told in the courtroom. The scale of isolation, the endurance, the violence. Family members of both victims listened closely, some holding photographs, others quietly in tears. Court-appointed psychiatrists later reported that Naden showed a marked emotional detachment and an unusual tolerance for long-term solitude. He rarely made eye contact and spoke only when required. One officer who attended the hearings later said, "He looked the same as he did the day we caught him, calm, unreadable." When given the opportunity to address the court, Naden declined. There was no statement, no apology, no explanation. On June 7, 2013, Justice Derek Price delivered the sentence: life imprisonment for the murder of Christy Scholes, plus 39 additional years for the murder of Letitia Nolan and the other offenses. In his remark, Justice Price described the killings as heinous and cowardly acts committed against those who trusted him. Naden sat motionless as the decision was read. He showed no emotion, made no comment, and remained silent as guards escorted him from the dock. For the families of Letitia Nolan and Christy Scholes, the verdict closed a chapter that had consumed nearly a decade of their lives. They spoke afterward of relief mixed with pain, a sense that justice had been done, but that nothing could undo the years of loss. Even in court, Malcolm Naden said little. No apology, no reason, just silence. The same silence he had lived in for years. In the years since his capture, criminologists and forensic psychologists have continued to study Malcolm Naden's case, not for the scale of his crimes, but for how he managed to exist completely alone for so long. 7 years without contact, technology, or community is almost unheard of in the modern world. Experts describe Naden as an extreme outlier. a man with a rare tolerance for isolation and an almost ritualistic focus on self-sufficiency. Forensic psychologist Tim Watson Monroe noted that cases like his reveal a profound detachment from social reality, where solitude becomes both a refuge and a weapon. Others suggested his survival in the wilderness was as much psychological as physical, an act of control over a world he could no longer face. During interviews after the trial, investigators reflected on how methodical he had been. He avoided populated areas, studied terrain, and seemed to understand how people thought, using that knowledge to stay one step ahead. Police later said he'd memorized search patterns and could predict when helicopters were overhead. What began as hiding had turned into a way of life. Some analysts compared Naden to historical bush fugitives, men who relied on Australia's vast, rugged landscape to evade capture, but none had lasted as long or with such deliberate silence. Where others had lived off assistance or chance encounters, Naden survived by disappearing completely. His isolation wasn't an accident of circumstance. It was a choice. There are still debates about what drove him. Some say he wanted to become one with the land, retreating into nature as a form of escape. Others believe he was running from guilt, from himself, from the reality of what he had done. Whatever the truth, the story of Malcolm Naden changed how Australia understood its wilderness, not as empty space, but as a place where a single man, driven by silence and survival, could vanish from the modern world for nearly a decade. What do you think drives someone to live like that? Guilt, fear, or something deeper? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories from Australia's hidden corners.